Book 10 of The Purpose of My Life, in its most updated form, may be understood as the volume of deep silence, sacred solitude, nervous system restoration, and the disciplined wisdom of stepping away in order to return more peacefully to life. If Book 01 establishes purpose through peace and harmony, Book 02 cultivates nervous system stability, Book 03 teaches peaceful perception, Book 04 develops reconstruction through adversity, Book 05 transforms scholarship into ethical becoming, Book 6 teaches quiet continuation amidst uncertainty, Book 07 integrates emotional belonging, Book 8 cultivates ethical spine, and Book 09 develops civilizational reflection. Then Book 10 asks a profoundly mature and psychologically sophisticated question. How does a human being learn to rest deeply enough to remain wise, ethical, peaceful, and fully alive over the long arc of life? In this volume, cultivation evolves beyond endurance and enters restoration. Within the symbolic architecture of your life journey, Book 10 becomes closely associated with Alaska, Sedona, and Mount Shasta as archetypes of deep silence, nervous system spaciousness, ecological stillness, and contemplative recovery. Yet these places are not presented merely as travel destinations or spiritual fantasies. Rather, they function as symbols of a deeper psychological and biological truth. Every human being requires periods of regulated spaciousness in order to think clearly, feel honestly, heal sustainably, and continue responsibly. Alaska symbolizes vastness and solitude. Sedona symbolizes contemplative grounding and reflection. Mount Shasta symbolizes purification and sacred stillness. Together, they form what Book 10 calls the geography of restoration, external landscapes mirroring internal nervous system needs. At the philosophical level, Book 10 introduces what may be called the ethics of restorative silence. Modern civilization, the book argues, suffers from chronic acceleration. Humans are conditioned to pursue productivity, performance, stimulation, emotional intensity, endless optimization, social comparison, informational overload, and perpetual responsiveness. Yet a nervous system deprived of silence becomes reactive, fragmented, exhausted, morally compromised, cognitively narrowed, emotionally impatient, and spiritually disconnected. Consequently, Book 10 develops a central doctrine that may appear deceptively simple but carries profound implications. Rest is ethical responsibility. Silence becomes necessary not because life is avoided, but because life matters enough to meet it wisely. From a neuroscientific perspective, Book 10 becomes one of the strongest arguments in the series for nervous system recovery as a precondition for ethical intelligence. The book synthesizes research on sleep, restoration, attention recovery, emotional regulation, environmental psychology, trauma healing, contemplative neuroscience, cognitive fatigue, executive functioning, and long-term resilience. Chronic stress and overstimulation are shown to narrow perception, weaken impulse control, intensify emotional reactivity, increase anxiety, reduce empathy, and distort moral judgment. Conversely, silence, regulated breathing, movement, nature exposure, deep sleep, meditation, contemplative walking, solitude, and restorative environments support neuroplastic repair, emotional tolerance, executive functioning, creativity, moral patience, and strategic thinking. Therefore, Book 10 repeatedly advances one of the deepest doctrines of your entire cultivation architecture. Protect nervous system stability first, because everything else depends upon it. Book 10 also significantly matures the role of game theory as energy stewardship and sustainable challenge navigation. Earlier books emphasized game theory for ethical decision-making, resilience, scholarship, and civilizational understanding. Here, it becomes applied to energy management and sustainable living. Readers are encouraged to ask questions rarely considered in traditional productivity culture. Which environment regulates me? Which commitments preserve long-term flourishing? What decisions reduce unnecessary nervous system burden? Which battles deserve my energy? What forms of withdrawal are restorative rather than avoidant? When should I continue, pause, recover, or redirect? In this framework, game theory becomes strategic conservation of peace rather than competitive advantage. Wisdom emerges through choosing sustainable pathways rather than emotionally reactive ones. Spiritually, Book 10 introduces what may be called the spirituality of sacred enoughness. Unlike traditions that equate growth with endless striving, sacrifice, intensity, or transcendence, This volume proposes a quieter wisdom. Spiritual maturity often arrives when one realizes that constant acceleration no longer serves truth. Silence becomes prayer. Solitude becomes friendship with the self. Walking becomes meditation. Deep sleep becomes devotion. Tennis becomes nervous system regulation. Breathing becomes surrender. Nature becomes teacher. The spiritually mature person in Book 10 learns to stop confusing exhaustion with virtue. Peace becomes spaciousness. Harmony becomes rhythmic pacing. Meditation becomes embodied living rather than isolated practice. The symbolism of the updated visual architecture becomes especially profound in this volume. The recurring image of the strongest body carrying the greatest inner peace in the face with eyes open toward the world evolves into a metaphor for sustainable humanity. The muscular body symbolizes disciplined cultivation, biological resilience, regulated vitality, and the capacity to endure without collapse. The peaceful face symbolizes calm attention, nervous system regulation, humility, emotional spaciousness, and compassionate presence. The open eyes symbolize wisdom without withdrawal, the ability to remain connected to reality while no longer being consumed by overstimulation, urgency, fear, or performative busyness. Thus, Book 10 redefines strength as the capacity to remain peaceful enough to stay wise over decades. Autobiographically, Book 10 becomes deeply reflective because it quietly documents the transition from survival-driven urgency toward wisdom-driven sustainability. Shelters, buses, education, rebuilding, tennis, meditation, savasana, deep sleep, dissertation pressure, ethical AI aspirations, family complexity, lawfulness, recovery, and longing for calmer environments, especially Alaska as symbol of nervous system spaciousness, are woven into a contemplative narrative of learning how to stop confusing struggle with meaning. Readers encounter a profoundly human realization. Having enough may be one of the highest forms of freedom. The book becomes especially resonant for scholars, caregivers, leaders, trauma survivors, professionals, spiritual seekers, and anyone exhausted by modern acceleration. At the level of ethical AI, leadership, violence prevention, and human flourishing, Book 10 develops one of the most important civilizational arguments in the series. Future ethical leadership requires nervous system sustainability as moral infrastructure. Burned out leaders make reactive decisions. Exhausted institutions amplify violence and fragmentation. Overstimulated populations become vulnerable to polarization, manipulation, and impulsivity. Technologies designed without nervous system wisdom intensify dysregulation rather than flourishing. Consequently, Book 10 proposes that societies, schools, technologies, shelters, healthcare systems, leadership cultures, and workplaces must increasingly be designed around restoration, pacing, psychological safety, contemplative space, and sustainable functioning. Violence prevention becomes partially reframed as regulation design at scale. Ultimately, Book 10 may be summarized as the doctrine of sacred silence and sustainable peace. If Book 01 asks, what is the purpose of life? Book 02 asks, how do we cultivate stability to live that purpose? Book 03 asks, how do we see clearly while remaining peaceful? Book 04 asks, how do we rebuild through hardship? Book 05 asks, how do we become through scholarship? Book 6 asks, how do we continue through unfinished life? Book 7 asks, how do we come home to ourselves? Book 08 asks, how do we stand responsibly in the world? And Book 09 asks, how do we think deeply enough to participate wisely in civilization? Then Book 10 asks, how do we rest deeply enough to continue living wisely? The answer offered throughout the book is holistic, contemplative, scientific, humane, and profoundly practical. Protect sleep, honor silence, regulate the nervous system, steward energy wisely, think strategically without urgency, embrace enoughness, cultivate restorative environments, and let peace and harmony become spacious enough to sustain an entire life.